Hello, thanks for joining today's session on biology. In this webinar, we're going to cover two sections of Chapter 25 in the biology textbook. And you're going to see some questions on your screen to follow along with, but you don't have to answer those or submit them in any way. They're just part of this presentation to help you follow along and see if you are understanding what we're going over. So this chapter is the Introduction to Animals. It's a pretty short chapter. But it starts off with some characteristics of animals and how we categorize them. So let's actually just start out by defining animal, because surely you're familiar with many types of them, but there may be some others that you don't realize are animals, such as corals or these sea sponges. So let's look at the characteristics that define these things as an animal instead of as a plant or a fungus or a bacteria or a protozoa. So the characteristics of animals: they have bodies that are multicellular. They are eukaryotic, which means all of their cells have a nucleus, unlike a bacteria, which doesn't. And their cells do not have cell walls. Plants and fungus do, but animals do not. So these characteristics help determine that all of these things pictured are considered animals. So then we look at how we can further categorize the animal kingdom. So the easiest, most inclusive breakdown that we have is chordates and invertebrates. So chordates are animals that have a nerve cord along their back, we usually call a spinal cord, and they have all of these characteristics for at least some part of their lives. A nerve cord along their back and a notochord, which is a supporting rod that goes behind that spinal cord, a tail that extends past the anus, and pharyngeal pouches, which are structures in the throat that may develop into gills or into other useful structures. So at first glance, this list seems bizarre because humans are chordates, we have a spinal cord, but we don't have tails, right? Well, actually, as embryos, we do. Humans and many other chordates have these traits as embryos and then lose some of them as they develop. So if you look at early pictures of a human embryo, you'll see that it does actually have a tail, and that just goes away as it develops. Same thing with the notochord, that goes away as the backbone develops, and the pharyngeal pouches develop into other structures in the throat and head. And there are some species that have a spinal cord, but they never develop a backbone. So that's why instead of invertebrates and vertebrates, we have invertebrates and chordates. So they don't have the vertebrae, but they do still have the spinal cord. So we call them chordates. And then looking at the other side, the invertebrates, these are animals that do not have a backbone or a spinal cord. And more than 95% of animals are invertebrates. But this word is actually not an official classification. This is not an actual taxonomic clade. Invertebrates is just a word that we use for discussing these animals. And the reason is just convenience, because there's actually 33 different phyla of animals on the same organizational level of chordates. So instead of chordates and invertebrates, we should actually say chordates and then list all these 33 things. They wouldn't all fit on the screen, but this is just the beginning of the list. So we use the word invertebrates just as convenience. It's just kind of a catch-all term that means all of these life forms that don't have a spinal cord. So all organisms, including animals, must maintain their internal environments and keep them stable. And the word for this is maintaining homeostasis, keeping a stable internal environment. So we're going to look at ways that animals do this and ways that animals survive. So this is often done through feedback inhibition. Feedback inhibition is a feedback loop in which the result of the process limits the process itself. So that means something is happening, and what whatever it does is what goes back and then tells the process to stop happening. So a great example of this is when you get really cold, your body starts to shiver. So if you're shivering, your muscles are moving to make heat energy. So as you shiver, your muscles are warming up, making heat until they're warm enough that they don't need to shiver anymore. So shivering solved the problem, and that's what made the shivering stop. Okay, so that's an example of a feedback loop. And there's thousands of instances of feedback loops actually happening in your body all the time, and the body of other higher organized, more highly organized animals. Um, Many of these happen on a molecular level. So there are molecules being created, there's enzymes working to break things down or make molecules, and the product that's created is what goes back and kind of blocks up the machinery so that more can't be created. And that way your body doesn't just keep making more of these and make too much of them. So all of that is feedback inhibition. Other things that animals need to do to stay alive. Gathering and responding to information. All living organisms do that. Taking in oxygen and distributing it to every cell. Taking in nutrients and distributing that to cells. And then getting rid of waste. So collecting the carbon dioxide from cells and removing it from the body. Collecting other waste and removing it. And they also lump in reproducing here, so an individual doesn't need to reproduce to stay alive, but animals all have a way to reproduce so that the species can stay alive. So it is important for the species to survive, so they just lump it in here with things that an individual would do to stay alive. That brings us to the end of this section, so we're going to do a couple review questions before we move on. So which of these do all chordates have? And there's multiple answers. So we've got notochord, a tail, cell walls, or pharyngeal pouches. I'll give you about 10 seconds to think about it. So we learned a few slides ago that chordates, again, animals that have a spinal cord, they all have notochord, a tail, and pharyngeal pouches at least one point in their lives. And again, these could go away. In humans, all three of these go away during the embryonic stage. In other animals, some of them are retained, some of them go away. But no animals have cell walls. That's one of the things that defines animals. They do not have cell walls. And our next question is, which of these things do all animals have? Whether they're chordates or invertebrates, every animal has which of these? And again, there could be more than one answer. Our options are backbone, a tail, eukaryotic cells, multicellular bodies, or pharyngeal pouches. And we discussed that definitely not a backbone, because remember, about 95% of animals are invertebrates. They don't have a backbone or a spinal cord. A tail is also something that only chordates have. Same with pharyngeal pouches. But eukaryotic cells is something that every animal has. So all of your cells have a nucleus. That's true for every animal. And bodies that have more than one cell. So section 2 is all about the body plans of organisms, animals specifically, the body plans of animals, and how we categorize them based on body plans and how that helps us determine what evolved from what. So first of all, to review the levels of organization, we learned in Chapter 7, bodies are made of cells, and similar cells are grouped together into tissues, and the tissues perform a job. tissues work together as organs. Organs are organized into organ systems, which control complex functions of the body, such as the digestive system, handles every aspect of digestion. So most animals exhibit some type of symmetry, and there's two types that we'll deal with. We have bilateral symmetry, which means that there is only one line that can be drawn down the body so that both sides are exactly the same. Generally, the front and back or top and bottom are different, but one side, the left side, is the same as the right side. So for example, in this butterfly, the only place we could draw a line um, and have both sides be symmetrical will be right here. So if you cut it in half right here, the left side is exactly the same as the right side. You couldn't cut a line this way because, let's just pretend that's a straight line there. Um, it wouldn't make sense. You've got the head up here and then the butt down here. They're not the same. The wings are not the same. And you can't just cut a random diagonal line because that's even worse. They're really unsymmetrical. So the only way to get a symmetrical side on each side of the line is right down the middle. So that's bilateral symmetry. The other type is radial symmetry. And this is when the body parts extend out from a central point equally on every side around it, so it makes a circle. And so there are many lines that can be drawn that would make a symmetrical half on both sides. So we could divide it in half with a line here or here or here, and they're all going to make a perfectly symmetrical other side. Okay, another way we categorize them is by development details. So most animals start as a fertilized egg, and they develop three layers called germ layers. And these are layers of tissues that eventually develop into all of the different body tissues. So we have the endoderm, which is the inside germ layer, and it develops into the linings of the digestive system and the respiratory system. And in these diagrams, the endoderm is the yellow portion in the middle. Then we have the mesoderm, which is the middle derm layer, and it develops into muscular, circulatory, reproductive, and excretory systems. So the mesoderm is what's shown shown as pink in these diagrams. And then you have the ectoderm shown in blue. This is the outer layer, and it develops into the skin and nerves. So again, these three germ layers are just layers of tissues in early development, and they distinguish themselves as three different layers, and then each layer becomes all of these systems as the body further develops. So this is related to how we classify some organisms based on their body cavity. So body cavity is a space filled with fluid which holds the organs and gives them room to grow. For example, the human abdominal body cavity holds the digestive system. And there are two types of body cavity. So a coelom is completely lined with tissue that came from the mesoderm. So you can see that in this diagram here, this earthworm. The coelom is this hollow area here. That's the body cavity. And it's completely surrounded by this pink tissue. And in the diagrams, pink is the mesoderm. So it's completely surrounded by mesoderm. It doesn't touch any of the other layers. So that's a coelomate. A pseudocoelomate is when the body cavity is only partly lined with tissue from the mesoderm. It may be lined by one part with tissue from the endoderm. So we could see that here. We have this hollow body cavity, and the outside of it is lined with mesoderm, but on the inside it's touching the endoderm, which is the yellow tissue in here. So it's called a pseudocoelomate. And there is a third type of creature, which would be an acoelomate, which doesn't have any body cavity at all. So you've got the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm, and you can see the mesoderm here is solid. There's no opening anywhere in that, so it just doesn't even have a body cavity. And the last type of categorization to talk about is also to do with development. So things start as a zygote, which is a fertilized egg, and cell division happens and the egg keeps dividing and more cells form until you get a blastula, which is a hollow ball of cells. So it's got all these cells on the outside and it's hollow inside. And then the blastula folds in on itself, kind of creating this tube that will become the digestive tract. So it starts at one end and it grows towards the other end. And the opening of that tube is called the blastopore. So that's right there where it opens. So that's the first side of the tube that develops. And then it can go one of two ways once this starts developing. If the blastopore becomes the animal's mouth and the other end becomes the anus, the animal is called a protostome. And if the blastopore becomes the animal's anus and the other end becomes the mouth, the animal is called a deuterostome. So this seems like a really weird thing to do to classify things to look at, but it actually is kind of important in that all chordates are deuterostomes and most invertebrates are protostomes, so it is pretty consistent. And the chapter ends with talking about the different phyla of animals. So you've got the kingdom of animals, and the next organizational level is called phylum. The plural of phylum is phyla. So each of these here depicts a phyla. There are many more than this. It's just showing you specific ones that you might be able to recognize, like sponges, jellyfish, insects. You've got fish, birds, mammals over here. So those are all Um, actually, I'm sorry. You've got chordates over here. That's a phyla. And then it breaks it down further into other stuff. Okay, so what I wanted to go over was how to read the cladogram. So you will see questions on your test that ask you about features of specific phyla. So that will be a little bit in the next chapter and also from this chapter. If you can read this cladogram, and there's also a chart on the same page with the cladogram or the page before it that goes over the different features of these. So make sure you look at those for your test. So how these work is we start at the bottom. I'm going to write in start. This is where the evolution is starting from in this picture. So anything at any point of it, you can just pick a random point, and anything above it evolved from an ancestor at that point. So okay, so for example, at the beginning here we would have a multicellular ancestor of animals, and all the animals came from it. But then we can say, look at this point, let's look at this point here, organs and 3 germ layers. So that happened right here. So anything that branched off from a point below there, so these jellyfish, let me change my color. All right, so these jellyfish branched off from over here before the point at which organs developed. So that means jellyfish do not have organs. These sponges also came from here. They do not have organs. They do not have 3 germ layers. But anything after that does. So all of these, everything up here and everything up here, they developed after this point. So they do have organs and germ layers. Okay, so we've got another example as a question here. Which of these do not have protostome development? And there's more than one answer. So jellyfish, which are right here, insects, snails, and fish. So which of these do not have protostome development? So let's just look at each one. Jellyfish. Well, jellyfish evolved and we're going to kind of go down this branch to where it started from. So they evolved back here. Deuterostome and protostome development happened here. So everything here kind of just followed one branch until this point where it branched off. So once we have organs and 3 germ layers, it splits. Some organisms developed this way and became protostomes. Some developed this way and became deuterostomes. So we've got kind of 2 clear branches there. But if we look at the jellyfish, they evolved and branched off before any of that happened. They started way back here. Okay, so definitely not jellyfish. All right, and let's look at insects and snails. So we've got insects up here. Let's see where they came from. So after the organs and 3 germ layers, it splits off into protostomes and deuterostomes. And on the protostome side, we go up to all of these organisms. So everything over here is a protostome. So that's going to be the insects. They're on the protostome side. And the snails, they are on the protostome side. So none of those developed as deuterostomes. Okay, they branched off over here before deuterostome development happened. And that leaves our last option as fish. So let's see, do fish are over here. So we have the organs and 3 germ layers. That continues on the path to fish. We have deuterostome development, which is what we're looking for. And that continues, and they evolved a few more things like segmentation and a backbone, and then we end up with the fish. Okay, so that is our correct answer. They do have deuterostome development. So that's an important skill to be able to have for this class, is to look at a cladogram and figure out what evolved when, what traits it has, what's more closely related to what. That's going to be something that comes up a lot. So that brings us to the end of the chapter. If you have any questions, here are 2 different ways to contact your instructor. We would love to hear from you. We want to help you if you get stuck with this at all, so definitely let us know if you have any questions.